right, well, it's 4:33, so I think we'll get started and stage will continue to monitor the waiting room. And I want to welcome everyone for our third in the Underground Railroad Consortium series of lectures. I am Mary Hayes Gordon. I'm very honored to be able to facilitate this today. I am a co-chair for the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission, and I'm very happy to be working with Judith Wellman and the group, many of whom are here, for the Fort Stanwix Research Project as well. Normally, I would ask Judith if she would like to say anything from the Underground Railroad Consortium.
No, let's move ahead because we have an exciting program today. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Yes, we do have an exciting program.
This.
And I do want to let everyone know that Sage Hazarika is our tech consultant here for the consortium, and he will be handling all of the tech capabilities today, including muting everyone except for the speakers generally. I do want to remind everyone we are recording this, and by staying on the program, we take that as consent for you to be part of the recording here today. And we will be taking questions at the end. We'll have a Q&A at the end, but if anyone wants to put questions in the chat during the presentation, I will monitor that and make sure that we get to them. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Jan DeAmicis is Professor Emeritus from Utica College in the field of sociology. He is also a member of the Underground Railroad Consortium and the National Abolition Hall of Fame. He is also my co-chair for the Oneida County Freedom Trail, and we have been able to work together for a number of years doing some very interesting and fun work, some of which he is going to talk to you about today, as this has been the basis of much of the work the Oneida County Freedom Trail has done. So, would like to introduce Jan DeAmicis and his presentation, From Slavery to Freedom, the Underground Railroad in Oneida County, New York. Jan?
And hello, everybody. My title page here shows two images. Each of those is an important Underground Railroad site in my program. The one on the left is the most mysterious. We can't find that rock, but that's a monument to a former enslaved man who became an Underground Railroad station master in New Hartford, later Utica. And the other are the graves of 7 freedom seekers, and that's Paris Hill, a completely different world from Utica. It's out in the countryside, as you can see, and this is one of the most poignant sites in our story of the Underground Railroad in Oneida County. So let's get started. A little background. I'm part of the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State, URCNY as we call it. And we're a group of organizations and individuals, but mostly organizations who've been studying the history of the Underground Railroad in our own respective areas. And you can see by looking at this that we cover the entire state, you know, upstate, downstate, the North Country, Niagara Falls, etc. This organization has allowed us to not only bring our conversation amongst ourselves more fruitful, but it also allows us to organize and pursue projects. And right now we have a number of projects that are working on. For one, we're trying to create some kind of a repository of all of the documents that we've gathered statewide on the Underground Railroad. We're pursuing an oral history project with respect to the Underground Railroad. We're pursuing presentations like this one that can be used in a variety of situations, a variety of contexts. And we're interested in pursuing a celebration of 2027, which is the date in 1827, the state of New York eliminated slavery and made slavery illegal. So we're involved in a lot of statewide projects, and this is just one part of a much larger effort. A brief introduction. Not everybody knows this, so I've got to assume that somebody doesn't. The Underground Railroad is not a railroad. It took me till I was 19 years old to realize that. But it was a series of safe houses. And it makes it, if I say that, it makes it sound like it was well organized, but it was really not that organized on a national level, but from safe house to safe house. You could find your way gradually to escape. The only place you could really escape to be free was Canada. And if you're living in Virginia, leave alone Mississippi or South Carolina, Canada is just, whoever heard of Canada? Whoever heard of the North? Whoever heard of abolitionists? Whoever heard of anything except your own little narrow world? A person running away from enslavement couldn't really expect to find much help. For one thing, there was a bounty on your head. Anyone could turn you in and make a lot of money. For another thing, federal law required that local magistrates help to recover escaped runaways. And finally, after 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law said that ordinary citizens had to help recapture fugitive slaves. So it was illegal to help. And if you helped, and if you were caught, you could be fined $1,000. For two of you say, no, that's about $75,000 today. And you could spend time in jail. So it was illegal. You could be caught, you could be punished. If you were enslaved, you could be caught, you'd be punished severely. So it was harbored, this process was secret or semi-secret. So they used the nomenclature of a railroad, station masters and conductors, but it was mostly a clandestine operation. I like to post that picture on the right because many people have never really seen an enslaved person. And this comes from the Virginia Slave Database, and there are a lot of images like this that are just so haunting, I just had to put it up here. I'm going to talk about three main ideas. First of all, there are a lot of different stories. There's an image of the Underground Railroad, you know, people are fleeing in the night and there are dogs and slave catchers behind them. And yes, that's one story among many, many others. And the sites that I'm going to show you today, each one has a unique story and it doesn't necessarily conform to that stereotype. So we're going to see a lot of variety in the kinds of scenarios and the kind of sites that were involved in Underground Railroad in Oneida County. We figure that at least 250 fugitives spent some time in Oneida County that we know of, and probably many, many more passed through that we don't know of. And we'll talk about how we know that. How do we know? How do you know if your site is an Underground Railroad site? And if anybody has ever heard of such things as the quilt code or lawn jockeys or hidden tunnels, you probably know what I mean. Oh yeah, well, they've got this quilt code that they knew how to look for. And so, no. That's totally been debunked. There are a lot of reasons to have a tunnel, and hiding runaways is not the only one. Hidden rooms were generally places to store your apples. Lawn jockeys are not a particularly useful thing. How do we know this? Because the runaways themselves didn't say so. And there are hundreds of accounts from fugitives who wrote their experiences down. None of them talk about this stuff. So how do we know? We go to documented information, oral accounts, academic literature, newspapers, census records, et cetera. It's things that you can pin down and prove. And the third thing is that we've uncovered more and more information about how extensive the interaction between African American and white European Americans in Oneida County was, as well as men and women alike in the success of the Underground Railroad. Very, very few people in the county were African American, but if it wasn't for them, there would have been no Underground Railroad, because the first place a runaway is going to look for is a friendly face. And even though there were very few with respect to the larger population, that small number of African Americans in Oneida County had an outsized influence on the success of the Underground Railroad, and it was successful. So we're going to look at these places in Oneida County. As you can see, they're scattered all over the county, and this is not an exhaustive list. We know of many, many more places and sites, and we're finding more every single day. And wait till we get into the county records and we start to dig up the wills of some of these places. We're going to have even more. So first, we're going to start at the Oneida Institute. And you can see that's right here. That's not hard to find. The Oneida Institute of Science and Industry, 1833 and 1834. That's a drawing of the time. And you can tell a number of things from this drawing. First of all, what you're seeing are dormitories, classrooms, workshops, and administrative building. The Oneida Institute of Technology was also a place where there was farming as well as education. This was maybe the most revolutionary school of the 20th century. I know I'm pushing that a little bit, but this is where the Oneida County's Underground Railroad gets a jump start, the Oneida Institute. And it begins with Mariah Greene, who is recruited, there's a lot of information I'm not getting around to lead the Oneida Institute on the condition, as he insisted, that it be a center of abolitionism. And abolitionism didn't simply mean the end of enslavement. It meant on immediatist principles. Now that was radical back then. Back in the 1820s, 1830s, a lot of, if you will, benevolent white people thought, well, how about just send African Americans back to Africa, the colonization? Maybe we should pay for people gradually to be freed. The immediatists said, no, freedom now, period. No payment, freedom. It's absolutely immediate, and that was so radical that they were considered a very fringe group. So to start an anti-slavery society based on immediatist principles already set you at odds with the dominant society. William Goodell publishes an anti-slavery newspaper, The Friend of Man, at the Oneida Institute. Suddenly you've got literature pouring out through the county, propounding the anti-slavery message. You have white and African-American abolitionists that are graduating and carrying the message. Some of these Black abolitionists especially were prominent in the abolitionist movement: Jermaine Logan, Alexander Crummell, and Henry Highland Garnett. Resistance, he said, resistance, resistance. Here's one image of Mariah Greene. He was radical. He might have been hard to get along with. He was very sure of his ways, but he had a very strong commitment to the abolitionist message and immediate freedom, immediate emancipation. So he is the supervisor of the Oneida Institute, and he's also an activist, and he starts to meet with all of the other sympathetic abolitionists in town, Alvin Stewart and such. He turns the Oneida Institute into an abolitionist center, and the students who go there know what to expect. They become part of the enterprise. They are not only studying, they're not only farming, they're not only being productive as a self-sufficient organization, but they are harboring fugitives, and most important, they're going around the county and they're talking to groups and they're organizing more anti-slavery societies all around the county. This didn't happen until this place showed up. One of the most prominent of the graduates is Jermaine Logan, who had escaped from enslavement in Tennessee. We'll talk about that a little bit later. He was one of the students at the Oneida Institute. He founded Utica's first African-American church, Hope Chapel, and he became well-known later on as the Underground Railroad station master in Syracuse. And he helped to orchestrate what they now call the Jerry Rescue, which was a violent rescue of a recaptured fugitive. And he was an open station master. That is to say, he advertised, bring them on, bring any fugitives here. Hundreds passed through his home in Syracuse, one of the more prominent of our graduates. Now, how do we know all this? And that's one of my themes. How do we know that these things are true? Well, for one thing, Milton Cernett did an awful lot of the work for us. And he wrote the book on the Oneida Institute Abolitionist Acts. And he makes the point that this is the first college in the United States that accepts African Americans and European American men on an equal basis. That is to say, we don't have a quota for Black folks. That is to say, Blacks and whites are going to create a model society, and they're going to be educated in Greek and Latin and how to farm and make things. They're going to be educated so that they can be independent, self-actualizing, and they're going to go out and spread the message. So we know that from Milton Cernett, and he's documented it with original documents. Copies of The Friend of Man that was published at the Oneida Institute, an abolitionist newspaper. Jermaine Logan, that runaway slave who becomes the slave master, the station master in Syracuse, he writes an autobiography and talks about it. We know the lives of the prominent graduates that went there, and there's been extensive documentation of Mariah Greene, the man who ran the place, in all manners of ways. You know, his role in organizing the New York State Anti-Slavery Society, and he had the honor of being burned in effigy because a lot of people thought he was just a little too radical. All right, now is a little breathless maybe. We're going to go talk about the Utica Rescue. This is one of the jewels in the crown, if you will. Here we're now going to Utica itself, and we're going to North Utica, right across As you're heading north, you're going to be crossing at the end of the days of the year. We're going to be talking about the Erie Canal. This is a headline from The Friend of Man, that abolitionist newspaper that was published first in Oneida Institute. And the Utica Rescue at Judge Hayden's law office was an event that we've been able to document very thoroughly, December 29, 1836. We know an awful lot about how this starts. Harry Bird, we know Harry Bird. George, we don't know his last name. We know that they were captured in Utica, we think on Post Street, we'll talk about that. And they're taken to the law office of Judge Chester Hayden on 96 Genesee Street. We know that they had been living in Utica. We know that they escaped from Shenandoah County. How do we know? Because they told us so. Judge Chester Hayden was no friend of the runaway. Judge Chester Hayden was one of the leaders of the anti-abolition riot 1 year earlier. He was one of the ringleaders, if you will. Judge Chester Hayden had the authority to send any African-American into enslavement on the simple word of a man-stealer. All I had to do, if I wanted to capture an African-American right off the street, I could just walk up and say, he's mine. You didn't have photographs. You didn't have any way to prove he's mine. And the judge had the right to send him back. You did not have the right of legal appeal. So if he could get you into that courthouse and send you back, free or not, you could be gone. So happily, a couple people see this going on. These are white people. Spencer Kellogg sees it happening, gets Alvin Stewart, who's a lawyer, and they argue with Chester Hayden that these guys ought to have a chance to prove that they're actually free men of color, and we will represent them. Hayden sees an issue coming up, says, I'll postpone the decision. I got to go to work at the courthouse. I'll be back tonight. While he's gone, as the sun sets, a crowd of people, and we think mostly Black men, subdued the slave catchers, beat them up as we're told, sent the former enslaved men to Mexico, New York, which is northwest of here, and then to Oswego, and we're certain then to Canada, because Oswego is on the border with Canada. And a quote from Jermaine Logan is one of the things that we have as evidence that this actually took place. Now, this is a little map, it could have gone anywhere, that shows the main routes of the nation's Underground Railroad, but I want to point out a couple things. First of all, these green arrows point the route that Harry Bird and George followed. And we know they followed that because we have word from them themselves and the process of escaping from Utica. They met up with somebody and explained their whole story. So they start in Shenandoah County, and the owner was a woman. She didn't own them, she owned the use of them. And she knew that when she died, these two guys were going to get sold, broken up, probably sent to Mississippi. She liked them. She gave them money, said, run away before I die, go to Philadelphia and look for so-and-so. They make their way to Philadelphia, which was a very powerful center of the abolitionist movement, but also a dangerous place to be if you were a runaway. Then they get sent to New York City. And we know that because they told us so. And then they went to Albany and to Utica, and then there's Little Mexico on the way to Oswego, New York, and then there's the St. Lawrence River. That's about a 600-mile journey. Probably walked a lot of it, could have used water a lot of the ways, but just imagine starting out 600 miles, you got a few bucks in your pocket, now what? We figure hundreds passed through Oneida County, and scholars estimate that more than 30,000 freedom seekers between 1830 and 1860, maybe more, maybe fewer. It's really hard to say. The very nature of trying to count them is very difficult. But it was enough of a problem that the South was very, very adamant about passing a strict anti-slavery law. This is where the Utica Rescue took place. This building now, you can see the windows are intact. They're all new. You can see it's got a good paint job. Actually, it now is even more modernized. It's a few years later, but that's not what it looked like when I first saw this building about 10 years earlier. Now, this is where it took place. This is where Judge Hayden's office was. We have this emblem, the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. The National Park Service has now certified this building as the site of the Utica Rescue at Judge Chester Hayden's law office on its National Network to Freedom. We are part of the National Underground Railroad map now. We can show this emblem on any piece of material that also is connected with the Utica Rescue. Here are a couple of the prominent people who were involved. Spencer Kellogg was a prominent civic leader. He helped to bring steam technology to Utica, became a mayor. He was a well-known person. And Alvin Stewart had national prominence as an abolitionist lawyer. Here's where the Utica Rescue took place. And you can see the look of that building back 15 years ago or so. I went all through the building with the guy who owned it then. And it was a shambles. There was no electricity, there was no water. The roof leaked, half the windows were broken. You can see it was where the city finally repossessed it. But you can also see, this is where Kellogg's store was, and this is where Chester Hayden's office was. Not Chester Hayden, but Alvin Stewart's office. So the whole action took place in this little block here, which is also part of the National Registry of Historic Places. It's the oldest contiguous set of buildings in the city of Utica. This is what the interior looked like. Utica College thought about purchasing the building and developing it as a historic site, but when they looked it over, they said, no, this is a money trap. It's going to cost $1 million. And then what are we going to do with it? But we looked it over pretty carefully. But then Vinnie Fitchie, a local businessman, he bought it from the city, cheap. Now his business is heating and plumbing. He went into that building with a vengeance. He replaced the wiring, the plumbing, the windows. He created 2 beautiful apartments. He overhauled the foundation, made it watertight, created some parking spaces in the back, and has proudly named it the Hayden Building. I haven't been in it in a year or so, but he's really thinking about putting a little section inside that mimics part of where Chester Hayden's office might have been. And we're going to have a sign, a freestanding sign in front of that as part of our walking tour. It's the last sign of the walking tour. We expect to have that going pretty quickly. How do we know that this happened? Well, contemporary newspaper reports, eyewitnesses, Jermaine Logan, letters from people who actually met Harry and George as they went to Canada, and they told us the story. The backgrounds of the people who were involved all tell us. Research into the owner of the slaves, John Geyer, his wills. I mean, we've got a lot of documentation that we know it happened. We proved it. Let's move on to Post Street. Post Street's in Utica as well. It's actually just a couple blocks away from the Hayden Building. This is what we think Post Street looks. I don't really know where the source of this comes from, but we're pretty sure it's about 1842. It's the period we're interested in. Most of Utica's African Americans lived here, but African Americans lived all across the city. They weren't like relegated here, but a large concentration. But what's important here is that they formed a little community that provides safety for Underground Railroad refugees. And people would find their way to Post Street, where they might even live for a while. You had a lot of, for instance, boarding houses. You could live there and maybe blend in a little bit before you decide what your next move was going to be. We know that a lot of the African Americans living here were involved in the Underground Railroad. They were certainly involved in the abolition movement. For instance, we know that they were involved in the Negro Convention movement, and we find their names on anti-slavery petitions. So we're pretty sure that Post Street is an Underground Railroad center. How do we know? Well, first of all, we're designating, that's one of the signs that we put up as part of our walking tour. That's our Post Street sign. Look how small Post Street is. It's not even a full city block. And this not even a full city block had such a powerful impact on the local Underground Railroad, because fugitives would go to Post Street and hang out there, a little street, not a real long city street, and hang out there before going on to someplace else. There's nothing original there on Post Street now, but they have replaced the sidewalk and they have replaced the street sign as well. How do we know what happened? Here's an example of how we know. This is an article from the New York Times in 1855. I don't know if I need to read it to you, but certainly they talked about Post Street. And it seems like this was not an unusual situation. Notice that they came from Kentucky, and I should have talked about that, where people were most likely to escape from. We know that many African Americans were involved in the Negro Convention movement, which was really the only public format that Black people had where they could protest as a group the conditions that they faced. They were blocked by rules of segregation and political powerlessness from making their voice known any other way. But by starting newspapers that they could circulate and by congregating into these conventions, they could make their voices heard in a way they couldn't do before. And African Americans from Oneida County were very important to that. We know one example of a story where a Black man, a Black barber on Post Street, guided two refugees to a settlement on Paris Hill. And I'll talk about that. We also know that freedom seekers were captured here. And we know because they wrote about it. J.D. Green, who ran away 3 times, got caught twice, made it the 3rd time. The 2nd time he ran away, he was caught here on Post Street. And we know that Harry Bird and George lived here on Post Street as well. We have a lot of sources that verify this. All right, how am I doing? We're going to go to Robert Everett and the Welch. And you can see we're covering a lot of territory. Now we're going to go into the more rural areas. There were a lot of Welsh settlers in the northern part, the northeastern part of Oneida County. And they found it very congenial to live here. It reminded a lot of them of Wales. They started a lot of dairy farms and other businesses. Robert Everett was a Welsh congregational minister who made his way there from Wales as a devoted abolitionist, and he sparks the abolitionist movement in northern Oneida County. I should say he and his wife, because his wife was very much involved in the anti-slavery movement as well. They had married in Wales and then made their way here. And in fact, their entire family became involved in the Underground Railroad. What made him influential was the fact that he published Welsh language literature there, either in his home or, yeah, it was in his home. Now, this was important because by publishing Welsh language literature, he had access to the Welsh immigrant community across the United States. And although he wasn't the only person publishing Welsh language literature, his came with a message that was very powerfully stated. And he threw his abolitionist energy into a variety of newspapers. He also got permission to publish Uncle Tom's Cabin into Welsh. And so Welsh households all across the country, well, the North anyhow, they would look forward to month after month reading the next serialized edition in Welsh of Uncle Tom's Cabin. If you've ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin, it reads like a modern soap opera. And you could just see them waiting for the next one. Well, up until that time, most Welsh people, being recent immigrants, were not interested in getting involved in a national controversy. By the time the Civil War arrives, by virtue largely of his Welsh language literature initiative, he has made very persuasive converts of the Welsh population who solidly supported abolitionism by the time of the Civil War. But of course, it wasn't easy. A lot of people didn't like him using his platform in the church to be protesting slavery. In fact, he lived in Western for a while. His house was burned down by protesters. But he would go out, he would send his parishioners out, and they would knock on doors and they would hand out petitions, and they would sign up to circulate petitions on a regular basis, and they would sending out these newspapers. He would send the newspapers free to ministers so that they would get read in the churches without having to pay for it. So this is kind of what they look like. Boy, the stern people. And that Capel Uca, you can see that cemetery right next to it. Robert and Elizabeth are buried there. The cemetery's there. The church is no longer there. But the cemetery it's a really poignant place to sit. If you sit there, you can look out over the hills, you can imagine you're in Wales even. But certainly you can imagine that this is a place where a small community of Welsh Americans made their voice known all across the country. Not only that, but they made their voice known in India, in Australia, in England, in Scotland, in Wales, because that's where his newspapers ended up going. Here's a copy of these newspapers. There's a whole collection of this literature at Utica College. And here's Harriet Beecher Stowe permission to publish his Uncle Tom's Cabin in Welsh. Now, how do we know this? Well, unfortunately, we can't translate Idetoled yet. We can't translate the Welsh language. I just talked to Nast Wynn, and she's going to help translate. But we've got an extensive collection of different newspapers, and Welsh American historians comment over and over again about the influence of this literature and the influence of Robert Everett. Now, if you read the mainstream literature on the Underground Railroad and abolition, you won't see very much about the Welsh. But if you read the Welsh American history literature, it is filled with references to this. We know about the anti-slavery petitions that they sent. We know about the evidence that the refugees spoke at their meetings. We have a lot of examples to show you. For instance, look at here. I'll translate for you. This is a meeting where they're signing up. How many days are you going to distribute anti-slavery petitions? And the translation there, George French, a fugitive slave from Tennessee. That is really a sweet little find. Followed by George Lawson. I mean, here's evidence that fugitives spoke there in front of this congregation. Here's a petition that was sent. Now, it should have been, we, the undersigned citizens of whatever county. They scratched that out. We, the undersigned Welsh inhabitants of Steuben and Remsen, Oneida County. They wanted it known. We're not just sending this to you, we're sending it from the Welsh citizens here. How do we know that the Welsh were so involved? Documents that I just showed you. Welsh American history literature, and I read a lot about that. The Welsh language newspapers, Welsh language Uncle Tom's Cabin. They're under their anti-slavery society that he established there, the first one in those two towns of Oneida County. This is the kind of evidence that we use to document the kind of presentation that I'm making. Okay, let's now move to Paris Hill. We went from way up here, we went through Utica. Here's Whiteside. Now we're going down to Paris Hill. The Paris Hill refugee community, and we've been doing a lot, especially Jews have been doing a lot of background research on the texture, if you will, of this refugee community. We know certain things happened. John Thomas, a companion, escaped from Maryland. They made their way to the home of Robert Johnson, a black barber on Post Street. Johnson guides them to Wesley Bailey, about a block away, an abolitionist and publisher of an abolitionist newspaper. Bailey takes them to Paris Hill. It's about a 25, 30-mile walk from downtown Utica. Probably stopped at the farm of Charles and Sarah Wills, which were a black farming family halfway between Paris Hill and Utica. When they got to Paris Hill, or Paris Green it's sometimes called, the white community there protected them. They provided them with employment. They provided them with safety. They ended up purchasing a house there. And they ended up being buried there as well. And they were part of a larger community of at least 7 freedom seekers who lived there in Paris as well. Here's their graves. Now, there's only one that's got an inscription, but there are 7 markers there. There's nothing really meaningful written on them. One of my archaeologist friends went and looked and we couldn't find anything. But that one in the middle there is almost evidence all by itself. Here's what it says. Excuse me a second. That's just one of the most precious finds that you can have. And it's right in the middle of this little old cemetery, right next to a volunteer fire department, overlooking this gorgeous, the gorgeous hills of Oneida County. We're pretty sure that that's the home of one of the people that employed them, Val Pierce. We know that they purchased a house. I'll show you how we know. And we know that they sent an awful lot of anti-slavery petitions from the town of Paris. Judy Wellman collected all of these petitions, and more than any other town in the county, except Utica, which was a city actually, this little small community of just a few thousand people were very engaged in the abolition movement. That we think, no, we know, I know that that's the home of Val Pierce. I've been inside there, Judy hasn't, but I've been downstairs. The foundation is period foundation, and the house looks like it's a period house as well. This is a real find. We think that is the house that the Roberts and Thomas families purchased. Looks like the right period. You can see on the map on the right that the Roberts and Thomas, there's their house. It's the right place. Knocked on the door, no one answered. We got to look at see if we can find a will that verifies it. But if so, that's a very exciting find. Runaways from enslavement who end up purchasing a house wide open. I told you there were a lot of stories. This is not the story of a bunch of people who ran through Oneida County and went to Canada. This is a story about a group of people who ended up staying here. How do we know? The inscriptions, census records that show not only who they were in their family structure, but where they were born. And if they were born in a slave-holding state in the South, that's very good evidence that they were in fact runaways. Anti-slavery petitions from Paris Hill residents, the maps that show the home where they lived, newspaper accounts. We have a lot of documentary evidence about this. It's really a find. We're going to talk about the Charles Wills farm. Remember I said that on their way from Utica to Paris Hill, they probably stopped at the farm of Black farming family, the Wills family. And they are halfway between Utica and Paris Hill. Charles and Sarah Wills farm. They were an African-American farming family. They owned at least 67 acres. That meant that they were a pretty decent farm. A house on Paris Road. The house still stands. Their home was an Underground Railroad station. We know that Charles Wills was involved in the abolition movement. We know that he donated money to the Oneida Institute, signed petitions, subscribed to abolitionist newspapers. And what put us on the track of documenting this as an underground station was that Mary Gordon, who is the host for this meeting, moved there with her husband Dean and discovered from neighbors who had long-standing property ownership right around it, that in fact this had been an Underground Railroad station. And they wanted her to know that because that was part of the history of the building. So that puts her onto the idea, well, she starts to track it down, and sure enough, it was a Black family. And sure enough, they were involved in the abolition movement, and they were probably Underground Railroad station masters as well. Now, they're halfway between Utica and Paris Hill. And it's not difficult to imagine that if you started off, say, when darkness falls, you start off, say, at 7 o'clock, you could walk to the Wills family farm in about an evening. It's about a 10-mile walk, maybe even less. And then you could walk the next evening to Paris Hill. About 2 nights would get you there. And then not a difficult, of course, it depends on the weather. So Mary is trying to get this certified as a Network for Freedom National Park Service site as well. We're working on that. But what an exciting find. Property owning farmer with a picture of him. What a rare thing it is to have a picture of one of these African Americans. We only have maybe 3, maybe 4 pictures of African Americans who even lived in Oneida County before 1860. And there's a drawing of her home. And the home, they live in that home right now as well. So how do we know about the Wills family? There's a lot more than what I have up here because Mary's been getting into the who married who begat whom, and so forth. And she finds the roots of the Wills family to be deep in the abolition tradition. But we know that the property ownership is for certain. We know how big the household was. We know he signed petitions. We know he subscribed to newspapers. We know that it was located on a route from Utica to Paris Green. And the oral tradition, they were very quick to tell her about the oral tradition, that this was certainly an Underground Railroad site. Here's an example of an anti-slavery petition that Charles Wills, you can barely make it out there, but that's Charles Wills there, right there. Just kind of the kind of evidence that we've used to document this. We're going to move to Florence, and you can see that's a long way away from Paris, long way away from Utica. That's about the farthest reach as you can get from Utica, and still be in Oneida County. That is way out in the boonies. Sorry, Jessica, but that is way out in the boonies. But what an exciting find. What an exciting find. The Florence Farming and Lumber Association was a unique experiment in an African-American independent community. It was organized by Stephen Myers, who was an operative in the Underground Railroad in Albany, which is 90 miles to the east of here. And he organized a plan on land that used to be owned by Garrett Smith. And I should do a whole PowerPoint about Garrett Smith, one of the richest men in America, lived in nearby Peterborough, maybe 40 miles from Utica, and gave away thousands and thousands of acres of land to African Americans so that they could be property owning, independent, and qualified to vote. You couldn't vote if you were Black if you didn't have property. So Stephen Myers plans a community that is self-contained and self-sufficient with it's based on farming or agriculture of some sort, lumbering. We're going to have mills, water-powered mills. They were going to have a church. They had a formal structure, et cetera, president, secretary, said, and by 1860, you can't find any trace of it. We know that at least one, and I'm sure there was more than one, at least one freedom seeker, Walter Hawkins, had a farm on this land. And we know where the farm was on the land. And we know that in 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed by Congress, he and his family left suddenly and moved to Canada. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a desperate effort by the South to control the flow of runaways from the South to the North. And they found that the old 1793 law that said that local magistrates had to help prosecute runaways, it wasn't being followed. And so the North was just not cooperating in the effort to protect their property. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 said, not only must local officials cooperate with federal officials to recover, quote, property, but that ordinary citizens must also cooperate in the apprehension of runaways, trying to deputize the entire population of free people. This had a very contrary consequence because it really made a lot of people very angry to be dragged into this. But the result was that a lot of people, fugitives who had lived in Oneida County quietly, picked up and left all of a sudden because bam, suddenly they're much more in danger than they were before. So we know that at least one Walter Hawkins and probably others. The site now, there are no real structures left, but we know it was there and it's being excavated archaeologically. How do we know that it was there? Well, newspapers, and I'll show you, donations from across the North, tax records of land ownership. Walter Hawkins writes about his experience there, firsthand experience, archaeological evidence. And here's an example of different places that were writing about this Florence Farming Association. And you can see on this right-hand side, you know, they've got a board, they've got a secretary. Walter Hawkins, the Freedom Secretary, was a secretary at one of these meetings. These newspaper accounts came from all across the North. So we know that it existed. This is Walter Hawkins. And this is one image, and I could have given you many images of how Jessica Harney is finding a way to excavate the Florence Farming and Lumber Association. So this is one of the archaeological surveys that shows where the traces of structures have been found. And she even has a map that she's gotten there, a Pomeroy map. This is just a couple of years ago. Now, if you go there, there's nothing to look at until you get into the woods. And her students are starting to mark it out. She's engaged her high school students. They're starting to mark it out, and they've got ribbons and they've got tapes, and they can show where buildings used to be. So the excavation is proceeding at a deliberate but very revealing pace. It's really making sense of the Florence Farming and Lumber Association. It disappears by 1860. You can't find any trace of it. Why did it disappear? Well, if you'd ever walked around there, you got a good idea why. It's a terrible place to grow anything except rocks. And the ground is uneven. And the rocks retain the moisture, so you've got soggy, swampy areas. very difficult to farm. And then these are people who didn't own a lot of property themselves. They had a difficult time paying taxes on the property. Before you could get the property productive, you had to cut down the wood. But that meant you had to live there, and that meant you had to have an income, and that meant you had to pay taxes. Gradually, I think, that's my hypothesis, that drove them out. They just couldn't pay the taxes. And I don't think that area was developed. Much of it was developed into farmland. It's really rugged area. Now we're going to go to Rome. It's a disappointment that we know so much about Rome, but we don't have anything physical to look at, not very much. Ellie Collins, one of the original members of the Oneida County Freedom Trail, she spent years gathering information about Rome's Underground Railroad, abolition group, abolition movement, and African-American community. So we know names and we have stories about a lot of these people, but I can't point you at things to say, this is where it happened and so forth. Other things have been used, especially Fort Stanwix, which was rebuilt in the center of Rome and completely led to the destruction of a lot of the sites that used to exist. So the good news is we have Fort Stanwix, and the bad news is we don't have those sites. But she's got a lot of information, and this is just a sampling. For instance, we know a lot more about how the Erie Canal was used to transport fugitives, because we know that Sally and Alfred Stevenson, living on Bouck Street near the canal, had a connection with her brother, Anthony Bowen, in Washington, D.C., and made it a point of using the canal to help to protect, to transport fugitives. We know that St. Paul's AME Church was an Underground Railroad station, but that's long gone as well. Some of the stories we have, like Marquise Kenyon had wagons. He had a stagecoach and wagon transport business, and we know that sometimes he would transport fugitives north by hiding them in a double bottom wagon or something. But those are the stories we have, but there are no wagons left. Now we're going to talk about, and this is the final entry, and how am I doing? I'm doing all right. I've got a little time, just a little time. Joshua Howe, this is technically, he lived in New Hartford, but now the area that he lived in is part of Utica. He was an African-American station master. And we know so much about him, but not quite enough. We know he was born enslaved. We know where and when he was born. We know that he lived in New Hartford, and we know that his household included 6 people, included a white wife. We know that he protected freedom seekers on his property. We don't know when he died. We thought we knew where he was buried, but we can't find any records to that effect. But we do know that in 1915, Utica, maybe one of the richest people in Utica, Thomas Proctor, dedicated a 6-ton boulder to the memory of Joshua Howe as an Underground Railroad station master. Well, whoever knew? 6-ton boulder, and he was going to put a plaque on this boulder, and it was going to be dedicated to an African-American Underground Railroad station master. We can't find the boulder, and we can't find the plaque, and we don't know where the site of the cabin was, but we know exactly where it should be. Now, how do we know in the first place? There's that picture, right? That was on the first page of my presentation. This is a 1915 newspaper from Utica Dispatch. 6-ton boulder. I asked my geology colleague at Utica College, how tall is a 6-ton boulder? And you know what she said? It depends. Okay, if it's so wide and it's, well, the problem is there's nothing to show it for scale. But if you look on the parkway, you see those boulders on the parkway. I think it's about the size of that. I bet that's the size of about a 6 foot, about 6 foot high. Now here's a real pointed piece of documentation. This is his certification of freedom. When he moved to Oneida County, he had to, quote, prove that he was a free man of color. And this is the transcription. I want to point yourself down to here, where Joshua Howe made his mark. He wasn't literate. We know from the newspaper article that the monument was going to be placed on the 5th green next to a flagpole. And here is a map that shows where that flagpole is. This area of South Woods at the time is part of Utica, but earlier was part of New Hartford. So we know where it should be. That's the very edge of the golf course of the 5th green. We know, well, this is one of the expeditions. I engaged a number of my colleagues at Utica College in my effort to find Howe's rock. It got to be a standing joke at the college council. Had you found the rock yet? But I got, geologists, I got archaeologists, I got physical anthropologists, I got cultural anthropologists, I got journalists. I had 10 to 12 people from Utica College involved at one time or another. That was about 10% of the faculty. This was one of the many expeditions, but we were equipped. That's a magnetometer that he's got there. She's got a magnetic, metal detector. We went up there, we were gonna find something, and we did. Well, first of all, the newspaper article said there was a pond. Well, there's a pond. We don't know for sure if it's human-made or if it's in fact a natural pond, but there's a pond where the map said there ought to be. These are some of the early members of our committee. There's Ellie Collins, she did a lot of work. Kevin Kelly, and Mary Ellen Ertz. Oh, we made a dozen trips. We found where the flagpole was. We found one rock on the entire green, and we thought that's got to be a huge underground rock. Turned out the rock was only a foot deep. We found some artifacts there, but the rock is not, that's not Josh Howe's rock. Finally, we're going to find something. And so I found a way to get Fort Drum's archaeologists, the National Park Service, from here at Florence Stanwix, and they brought their underground radar imaging system. Now, they couldn't do the whole site, but they marked off certain plots, and they found substantial evidence of subsurface anomalies. That is to say, they were not natural. It wasn't a natural subsurface phenomenon. They couldn't tell it was a structure. They couldn't tell what it was. You'd have to dig, you'd have to truth the area. You'd have to dig it up to find, but that didn't answer the question. Where is Howe's monument? We know where it is now. See those mounds, right? If you walk around to all the greens on that 18-hole golf course, you won't see any more mounds. But you get up to that 18th hole there and you see these mounds, and we ran our magnetometer over those mounds, couldn't find anything. But then we found this newspaper article. And you can see that the WPA people who were improving that place ran into some boulders, didn't know what to do with them. I know what they did with them. They buried them. Now, the newspaper article said it took a week with yoke of oxen to haul that boulder up here. We looked in the ravine next to it. No, it wasn't there, and they didn't break it up. They buried it in one of those, and probably they never got around to putting on the monument. I want to put a sign up somewhere to honor Joshua Howe. How do we know? That article was very important, but we have a lot of information about Howe himself and his family. All right, conclusion. Careful documentation, scrutinized for its legitimacy, has made it possible for us to tell a lot of stories. And the stories all involve cooperation of white and black and men and women. If fugitive stays in a house overnight, who cooked? Who took care of the bedding? It was women. Their names are not often mentioned. We've made a real effort to try to capture the women involved. But there was always the risk. And this is from James C. DeLong, and they talk about, remember Alvin Stewart, who was part of the Utica Rescue, the lawyer. He and Alvin Stewart are talking about how a recent fugitive rescue almost didn't happen. They almost got caught, and there are slave catchers around. We better wait for the next one, right? That's a very poignant piece of information to show that, yeah, they knew that there was danger there. Briefly, the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission, the information that you got here, I didn't dig it up. We all dug it up. We've been working on this for a long time. Everyone's made contributions. I simply put it together in a PowerPoint. We have 5 active members. Ellie Collins, one of the initial founders of the group, she's relocated, but she hasn't officially resigned, so we haven't officially canceled it. And her stuff on Rome is very important. Jessica continues her work with her students to document the Florence Farming and Lumber Association. That's her big project. She's also works with the National Abolition Hall of Fame, and she works with the artifacts, I think. Mary and Jan, we're working on our 6-sign walking tour of Underground Railroad sites in Utica. We're part of the Fort Stanwix Project. And I'm part of Earth News. Deirdre her novel is being published as we speak, and it centers on the Underground Railroad in Utica right about the time of the mid-1830s. She's also part of the Fort Stanwix Project, and she gave one of these webinars on Utica's anti-abolitionist violence not too long ago. And Ellie Collins, bless you, Ellie, your research has gone a long way to helping us document the Underground Railroad in Rome. And that would be the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Jan. That was awesome. And I know